Hi, welcome to the channel. The British American War of 1812 explained in 13 minutes. All right, we're going to check this together. Let's check it out.
In 1812, the young nation of the United States took on the country with the most powerful navy in the world in a war that would affect more than just the former colonies and their colonizer. The United States of America first gained freedom from the British in an 8-year-long Revolutionary War that finally came to a close when Britain inevitably recognized the independence of their 13 former colonies on September 3rd, 1783. One of the most relevant impacts of this war that would fuel future tensions between the US and Britain once again was the role of the Native Americans. And as a fan of our channel, you should check out our friends over at...
Interesting. I'm sorry, I'm just going to speed this up because that looks like an ad. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah.
The Native Americans mostly supported the Brits, who they hoped would continue to restrict expansion from the US settlers into Native American territory. When Britain failed to maintain its rule over the colonies, the United States eventually accelerated its takeover of native land, causing even more friction between the American societies. This friction only grew stronger as the years went on, as Britain remained a driving force of the discord, since not only had the natives taken its side in the Revolution, but the British also openly encouraged the Native Americans to fight back against their antagonists. By 1812, this, combined with a few other factors, led to the development of a new war. While the United States was clearly unhappy with the united opposition from Britain and the natives, they were also infuriated by allegations that the Royal Navy was utilizing a tactic known as impressment to take US men for their own troops. On top of this, the ongoing strife between Britain and France had a notable impact on the United States, heavily...
First of all, let me pause here. Lots of strong nations back in history that are still standing today. Wow, regardless. Talk about the United States, United Kingdom, France. I'm sure there are lots more stronger countries that are still standing today, right?
Infuriated by allegations that the Royal Navy was utilizing a tactic known as impressment to take US men for their own troops. On top of this, the ongoing strife between Britain and France had a notable impact on the United States. Heavily locked in their own struggle, the warring nations tried to restrict trade from neutral countries and punish anyone who attempted to ignore the constraints. This put the United States in a detrimental position due to their inability to continue trade with either nation unless they wanted to risk invoking the wrath of the other side.
Wow.
While France took a more laid-back approach to ensure the US abstained from doing business with the British, the latter was more aggressive about the matter.
So basically, this first part is introducing the British, France, Americans, right? Okay.
January 7th, 1807, Britain issued an order in council stating, "It is hereby ordered that no vessel shall be permitted to trade from one port to another, both which ports shall belong to or be in the possession of France or her allies, or shall be so far under their control as the British vessels may not freely trade." Furthermore, any ships that refused to obey these restrictions would be subject to seizure by the Royal Navy, cargo and all. By November, the original order was expanded, now to include all the ports and places of France and her allies, or of any other country at war with His Majesty, and all other ports or places in Europe, from which, although not at war with His Majesty, the British flag is excluded, and all ports or places in the colonies belonging to His Majesty's enemies. In retaliation, France, under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, issued the Milan Decree, which said that every ship to whatever nation it may belong that shall have submitted to be searched by an English ship or to a voyage to England, or shall have paid any tax whatsoever to the English government, is thereby, and for that alone, declared to be denationalized, to have forfeited the protection of its king, and to have become English property. Adding on, Napoleon declared that any of the aforementioned ships that enter French ports or those of French allies are good and lawful prizes of his nation.
Now, this is where some nations would want to stay back to say, oh, I don't want to get involved in this. We're allies, but I mean, I don't want to get involved in this because someday, in the future, I might want to do business with you. And some countries or some nations may want to hold it on to say, oh, well, remember you once supported this whatsoever. But, interesting.
Forced to reply, U.S. President Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act in December of 1807, blocking all international trade from American ports and taking direct aim at Britain. Unfortunately for America, the act backfired and turned the U.S. into more of a victim than anyone else. Emphasizing this point, the Minister to France himself even said, "Here it is not felt, and in England it is forgotten." The effects of the Embargo Act ultimately pushed the U.S. into an economic depression, and it had to be repealed less than 2 years after the initial signature. In its place, the Non-Intercourse Act was passed, which directly forbade trade with Britain and France and their colonies. When this new act still proved to be ineffective, the United States tried once again, this time passing Macon's Bill No. 2 in May of 1810. This bill lifted trading bans and stated that if either France or Britain removed their own restrictions, the U.S. would re-establish an embargo with the opposing nation. By August, Napoleon enacted a plan to exacerbate tension between Britain and the United States, and it ultimately worked. He first told the new president, James Madison, that he intended to exempt the U.S. from his previously established Berlin and Milan decrees, promoting Madison to bring back the Non-Intercourse Act constraints against Britain in November of that year. Despite the fact that Napoleon never actually followed through on his proclamation, Britain and the United States were now on the brink of all-out war.
Oh! Wow.
Final straw came when the Battle of Tippecanoe unfolded in late 1811, as the U.S. troops claimed victory over the Native Americans, wishing to stop further expansion once again. Given the United States was fairly confident in the belief that the British were supplying the natives with weapons from Canada, a faction of the U.S. Republican Party known as the Warhawks began a heavy push towards an official declaration of war. At last, on June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed the declaration against Britain, despite contention about the issue coming from both the House and Senate. Another problem emerged as well when Britain decided to suddenly repeal their trade restrictions before news of the U.S. declaration of war actually reached the British over a month later. Aware of this delay, Britain decided not to immediately respond to the call of war and waited to see how the Americans would react to their repeals. When the U.S. got wind of this surprising development, they were, in turn, unsure of how the Brits would react to their declaration of war. Ultimately, the United States decided to follow through on its proclamation and did so by invading Canada, which was a British colony at the time. While the American troops hoped to capture Canadian land to force Britain into negotiation, they had no such success. No one was prepared for war. The British and French have been—
Wow. Now I see this. I fully understand this. Miscommunication, misunderstanding, and testing power, who is the strongest and whatever. Land ownership, we get that. But who wants to be on top? Okay, let me test this. Let me try to force your hand or to get you to some. I see that. I see that. Okay.
busy fighting their own
Let me
battles,
take
and
it
the
back. Hold on. Yep.
force Britain into negotiation, they had no
let's
such
take
success.
a bit teeny tiny back. Yeah.
British colony at the time. While the American troops hoped to capture Canadian land to force Britain into negotiation, they had no such success. No one was prepared for war. The British and French have been busy fighting their own battles, and the US military was grossly ill-suited to take on the likes of Britain. The defeats were plenty and humiliating for the Americans. One excessively humbling loss for the US happened when General William Hull surrendered Fort Detroit on August 16, 1812, and his own army to the British troops, and allowed Michigan territory to be deemed as part of Britain. Chased across the Canadian border, as Hull saw the size of his opponent's forces, which was a mix of British and Native American troops, and knowing that his daughter and grandchild were in the fort, he decided to give up without a single shot being fired. Hull's disgraceful failure led to an uptick in Native American raids in the Northwest, and British conflict under the command of Major General Henry Proctor. Adding insult to injury, U.S. Brigadier General Henry Dearborn struggled to make any progress on the northeastern border because the militias in New England were not supportive of the war and uninterested in coming together for an attack on Montreal. By October, the Americans were finally able to get some momentum as Major General Stephen von Rensselaer led an army of 3,100 militiamen into the Battle of Queenston Heights. Rensselaer sent some advanced units across the river, where they were able to hold their ground for some time on a slope just above Queenston, and were successful until they were overcome by British forces as the rest of the American troops refused to join the fight. 925 US soldiers were then captured by the British despite Major General Isaac.
Take it back a bit. I heard something.
And were successful until they were overcome by British forces as the rest of the American troops refused to join the fight. 925 US soldiers were then
925 US soldiers. Wow. It might not seem like a lot, but that's a lot.
Captured by the British despite Major General the American troops refused to join the fight. 925 US soldiers were then captured by the British despite Major General Isaac Brock on the British side being killed during the battle. Yet again, the Americans took another hit in 1813 when an attempt to retake Detroit resulted in a massacre of US prisoners by their Native American opponents. On top of that, Brigadier General Henry Dearborn was replaced by Major General James Wilkins. At long last, though, in September of 1813, U.S. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry scored a major naval victory at Lake Erie against the forces of British Captain Robert Barclay and opened the gates for more success on the American side. When the Battle of the Thames erupted the following month, the U.S. finally defeated the British and Native American Allied forces. The next spring season, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, a U.S. militia force faced off with a Native American force known as the Red Sticks and found victory once again, demanding that the losing side cede roughly 23 million acres of land, which would later become Alabama and span partially into Georgia. Another win for the United States followed in the summer, July of 1814, at the Battle of Chippewa, but it was short-lived as the Battle of Lundy's Lane ended in a bloody stalemate shortly after, forcing the Americans to withdraw. The real deciding factor in the
Wow, this is a lot. This is a lot, if we're being honest. If we're being honest, test of power, who is the strongest or whatsoever. We get it, like it's a fight for survival, right? But it's also giving test for power, quest for power, miscommunication, misunderstanding, and maybe hatred. Because nobody wants to even talk about that. Hatred. Or kind of like you're stronger. I want to be the one with the highest power. Or instead of I just think lots of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and like let's just go. Let's go. they would succumb, right? You just imagine if like both nations came together. Picture that for a moment. If they both came together, understood each other, understood themselves, like, let's not go to war. Let's just call a truce and say, okay, I give you this, I take this. Just imagine that.
War came when Napoleon faced his first exile, allowing Britain to shift
Wait,
more
what?
focus
Who?
shortly after, forcing the Americans to withdraw. The real deciding factor in the war came when Napoleon faced his first exile, allowing Britain to shift more focus to the discord with the United States. The British sliced through the US, destroying government buildings including the White House as they took control of Washington, D.C. The Brits then tried to push farther into Baltimore by September under the authority of General Robert Ross, but were repulsed at the Battle of North Point, where General Ross was killed. In the battle that inspired the US national anthem, more British troops were fought off at Fort McHenry. As these conflicts raged on, peace talks began in Ghent and eventually resulted in a signed treaty on December 24, 1814. Still, just as with the declaration of war, the news was delayed and took until February 18, 1815 to officially be ratified and end the war. The Treaty of Ghent reverted things back mostly to how they were before the combat, with a status quo antebellum. All territory was returned. Britain repealed their trade restrictions, stopped supporting the Native American revolts, and ended their impressment strategies. In the end, the war was essentially a draw, and the only real losing side was the Native Americans, who had high hopes for British help in stopping US expansion. Britain was able to claim victory against the French, and in a way, against the US. Meanwhile, the US had the pride of more or less winning their second war of independence.
But still, this was good information regardless. I still believe that lots of misunderstanding were here, and I still believe that um all of this wouldn't have been necessary. Yeah, lots of nations came today as a result of this, but I just think that all of this would have been avoided if everybody like come to an agreement, understood themselves, and stay loyal. Loyalty. Stay loyal to say, yes, okay, I understand what you just said. We come to an agreement and let's respect ourselves and respect our lanes. Rather, be allies rather than fighting against each other. You get what I mean? But still, but still, this was good information, interesting. I mean, both. Obviously, this is from everybody's perspective is going to be different. The British perspective is going to be different. The Americans' perspective is going to be different. Maybe Canada's perspective too, because they sort of like they weren't affected, but they sort of like kind of got in the middle. Their perspective would also be different, and I just think like maybe France or French, their perspective too would sort of be different. But let me know what you think regarding this. Maybe if there are a couple of videos that will talk about the American perspective, that would also sort of talk about the British perspective in depth. Also, maybe kind of like the Canadian perspective or the French perspective too. I would love to dig into those to also learn to hear, see what they think or how they perceive this as well. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. And until next time, see you in the next video.